The first time Letitia Fairchild fired a rifle in the town square of Caldwell, Kansas, she was 23 years old. The year was 1879, and every decent man within 100 miles decided she was someone else's problem to love. She had not fired it at anyone, which the townspeople would later concede was a point in her favor. She had fired it at the rattlesnake that had coiled itself beneath the wheel of Hester Pruitt's wagon, while Hester stood frozen on the boardwalk, too paralyzed by fear to do anything useful. The snake was dead before the echo of the shot had finished rolling across the flat Kansas plain, and Hester was saved, and Letitia had lowered the rifle with the calm efficiency of someone who had been solving problems with practical tools her entire life. But the gathered crowd of men who had watched her do it looked at one another with the particular unease of people who have witnessed something that does not fit neatly into the world they have constructed in their heads. Reverend Albright said, 2 days later in his Sunday sermon, and without naming her directly but with his eyes resting on her pew, that a woman who carried herself like a soldier was unlikely to find peace in the home she deserved. 3 of the town's eligible bachelors, Clement Dover, who ran the feed store, Augustus Crane, the land surveyor, and young Percy Whitfield, whose father owned the largest cattle operation in Sumner County, had each, in their own way and in their own time, expressed interest in Letitia Fairchild over the previous 2 years. Each had retreated when they discovered she would not soften herself for their comfort. She would not pretend she did not know how to read a legal deed. She would not feign confusion about cattle prices. She would not laugh at the right moments and go silent at the others. She was, as Clement Dover had said to Augustus Crane over whiskey at the Silver Spur Saloon, too much woman, too much opinion, too fierce for any decent man to love. The words had gotten back to her, as words in small towns always do, carried by Hester Pruitt herself, who was apologetic about it. Her round face creased with guilt as she set down a jar of preserved peaches on Letitia's kitchen table as a kind of offering. Letitia had listened to the words, poured 2 cups of coffee without speaking, sat down across from Hester, and said simply, "Well, then I suppose I do not need a decent man." She had said it with more confidence than she felt, because the truth, which she kept in the private place where women like Letitia Fairchild kept the parts of themselves that felt too tender to survive the open air, was that she wanted to be loved. She wanted it the way the plain wanted rain, not desperately, not with the frantic urgency of something dying, but steadily, with the deep certainty that without it, something essential would remain unfinished. She wanted a man who could stand beside her without flinching at who she was. She had simply stopped believing such a man existed in Caldwell, Kansas. She lived on the 40 acres her father, James Fairchild, had homesteaded in 1869, 10 years before his death from a chest illness that had taken him slowly, and then all at once in the winter of 1877. Her mother, Ellen, had died in childbirth when Letitia was 7, and so she had grown up alongside her father, learning not the things most fathers taught daughters but the things James Fairchild simply knew and had no one else to share with. How to read the sky for weather. How to negotiate with cattle buyers who assumed your ignorance. How to shoe a horse in a pinch, though she preferred to leave that to the blacksmith when one was available. How to keep ledgers and how to know when a neighbor was cheating you with a handshake deal, and how to smile through it and make sure they never had the chance to do it again. When James died, he left Letitia the 40 acres, the 2-room house he had built with considerable effort and moderate skill, a solid gray mare named Constance, and a stubbornness so deeply bred into both of them that not even death had managed to remove it from the equation. She had been running the place alone for 2 years when Matthew Quinn rode into Caldwell. He came in on a Thursday afternoon in late April of 1879, which was, as Letitia would later say, the kind of day that feels like a beginning without announcing itself as one. The sky was that particular shade of blue that Kansas does in the spring when it is trying to make up for all its other weather, and the cottonwoods along Elm Creek were just beginning to show their new leaves, pale and trembling in the warm southern wind. Matthew Quinn was 30 years old. He had a face that weather had worked on without quite finishing, sharp angles beneath sun-browned skin, dark eyes that assessed a room the way a carpenter assessed a wall, looking for where it might give. He wore a single Colt revolver on his right hip with the easy familiarity of a man who had owned one long enough to forget it was there. He was not handsome in the way that Percy Whitfield was handsome, that smooth, well-fed handsomeness that came from never having gone hungry or cold, but he was something better than handsome. He was real in the way that things made by hard use are real, solid, and purposeful, and shaped by the life they had actually lived. He had come to Caldwell looking for work and had found, at the Silver Spur Saloon, a conversation with Roy Blevins, who owned the largest livery operation in town, and who was, coincidentally, also the man who had been quietly trying to acquire Letitia Fairchild's 40 acres for the better part of 18 months through a series of legal maneuvers that were not quite dishonest, but were certainly not honest either. Matthew did not know any of this when he took the job Blevins offered him. Blevins had told him he needed a capable man to help manage his operations, handle some livestock transport, keep an eye on a few properties he had interests in. It was vague work, the kind that paid well enough that a man who had been riding for 3 weeks without steady employment did not ask too many questions. Matthew had asked one question: "Is anything about this work that would land me in front of a judge?" And Blevins had laughed and said of course not. What kind of man did Matthew take him for? And Matthew had accepted the wage and the use of a bunk in the livery, and had left himself the private option of reconsidering if it turned out Blevins had been lying. The first time Matthew saw Letitia Fairchild was the following morning, when she drove her wagon into town with a load of timber she intended to trade at the general store. She handled the team with the kind of quiet authority that comes from years of practice, reading the horses through the reins as naturally as breathing. She wore a plain brown dress and a wide-brimmed hat against the morning sun, and her dark hair was pulled back at the nape of her neck with a practicality that had given up on ornamentation without apology. She was not performing anything for the benefit of the watching street. She was simply herself, moving through the town with the solidity of someone who knew exactly where she stood and did not require anyone else's opinion about it. Matthew was standing in front of the livery when she drove past. He watched her because something about the way she sat that wagon seat commanded watching: the straight spine, the steady hands, the unhurried purpose in her eyes as they moved over the street ahead of her. She glanced at him as she passed, the instinctive assessment of a woman alone in a public space, cataloging potential threats and dismissing them, and then she looked away. It was not an encouraging look. It was not meant to be. He found out her name from the livery boy, a 14-year-old named Tobias, who knew everything about everyone in Caldwell, with the comprehensive thoroughness of someone who had nothing better to do than listen. "That's Letitia Fairchild," Tobias said, looking in the direction the wagon had gone. "Her daddy had the Fairchild place out on the East Road. She runs it herself now. Clement Dover tried to court her and she told him she didn't need a man who couldn't read a land survey to help her find north. He said this with visible admiration. She can shoot the tail off a hawk at 200 yards. Some of the men in town are scared of her." "They scared of her shooting or her opinions?" Matthew asked. Tobias thought about it seriously. "Both, I reckon, but mostly her opinions." Matthew nodded and went back to work. He did not think about her again immediately, because he had enough to occupy himself with. Blevins's operation was larger than the initial conversation had suggested, and as Matthew spent his first week in Caldwell learning its contours, he began to develop the uneasy feeling that the man's description of honest work had been, at best, optimistic. There were records that did not quite add up. There were conversations that Blevins stopped when Matthew walked into rooms. There was a document he was asked to transport to the county land office, sealed, that he was told firmly not to open, which was the kind of instruction that made any intelligent man want very much to open it. He did not. Not yet. He folded the unease into the back of his mind and kept his eyes open and his mouth closed, which was a skill he had developed over 30 years of navigating a world that frequently required it. The first real conversation he had with Letitia Fairchild happened on a Saturday, 8 days after he arrived in Caldwell. He had ridden out to the eastern properties that Blevins had interests in to check the fencing on a parcel Blevins was leasing to a neighboring rancher, and had taken the east road, which ran past the Fairchild place. The property was what it was 40 acres of good flat land with a small creek running along its southern edge, a solid if modest house, a barn that had been repaired recently and competently, a vegetable kitchen garden that was just coming in behind the house, and a pasture with 4 cattle and a horse grazing in it. It was the property of someone who worked hard and expected nothing from luck. He had pulled up at the gate on the road to check his direction when the voice came from behind him. "You are on Roy Blevins's payroll." It was not a question. He turned in the saddle and found Letitia Fairchild standing at the fence line of her eastern pasture, 30 yards away, with a fence-stringing tool in one hand and a length of wire in the other. She had clearly been working the fence and had stopped when she heard him on the road. She was looking at him with the clear, direct gaze of someone who was waiting to see what kind of man he was going to be. "I am," he said. He did not see any reason to pretend otherwise. "Then you should know," she said, "that the east boundary of this property is the survey post 20 feet behind where you are currently standing, and not the one Blevins has marked with his own stakes, which are 6 feet into my land. If you are here to measure anything, I suggest you bring the county records because I have them." He stared at her for a moment. "I'm here to check fencing on the Hennessy lease," he said. "I'm not here about your property." She studied him with the same calm assessment she had given him on the street. "Good," she said, and went back to her fence. He should have ridden on. He told himself afterward that what stopped him was the practical question of the misplaced survey stakes, because if Blevins was pulling that kind of thing with his neighbors, it was relevant to Matthew's already present concerns about his employer. But the truth was that he stopped because there was something about the way she had said everything she needed to say, and then simply turned back to her work, the absolute unapologetic economy of it, that he found he was not quite ready to ride away from. "He has stakes on your land," he said. She paused without turning around. 6 feet into the southeast corner. "I found them last Tuesday. I have written to the county surveyor's office in Wellington." "He know you've written." Now she turned. The look she gave him was measuring him again, deciding something. "Why would you care about that if you work for him?" "I'm asking because if he knows, and he has the kind of character I'm beginning to suspect he has, then you are going to want to know what he is planning to do about it." There was a silence in which the wind moved through the new grass of her pasture, and her horse, Constance, lifted her head from grazing to watch them both with large brown eyes of total indifference. "And what kind of character are you beginning to suspect he has?" Letitia said. "The kind that pays well and tells you not to ask questions," Matthew said, "which is the kind of character I am in the process of reconsidering my association with." She looked at him for another long moment. Then she set down her fence tool on the top rail of the fence and walked toward him, stopping on her side of the gate, looking up at him where he sat his horse. Up close, he could see that her eyes were a dark amber color, the shade of good whiskey held up to lamplight, and that there was a smudge of fence grease on her left cheekbone that she was not the least bit concerned about. "My name is Letitia Fairchild," she said. "My father homesteaded this land in 1869. I have the original deed, the survey documents from 1871, and a letter from Senator Preston's office acknowledging the legal filing of the claim. Roy Blevins has been attempting to acquire this property through legal and extra-legal means for 18 months, and every single one of his attempts has failed because I keep better records than he does." She paused. "What is your name?" "Matthew Quinn." "Mr. Quinn," she said. If you are genuinely reconsidering your association with Roy Blevins, I suggest you do it quickly, because he is not a patient man and he does not handle interference well. And if you are here on his behalf to assess my vulnerabilities, you should know that I have none that I have not already accounted for." She picked up her fence tool, turned, and walked back to her work. Matthew Quinn rode down the east road toward the Hennessy lease with the distinct and somewhat disorienting sensation of a man who has just met the most interesting person he has encountered in years, and is not at all sure what to do about it. He quit Roy Blevins's employ 4 days later. He had, in those 4 days, found 3 more things that concerned him. A copy of a legal filing that suggested Blevins was attempting to challenge the Fairchild homestead claim on a technicality related to the original filing date. A conversation overheard between Blevins and a man named Cutter who worked for him, and who Matthew recognized as the kind of man who solved problems with his fists when other methods failed. And a clear pattern in Blevins's land records of acquiring properties from families who had encountered sudden unexpected difficulties: a fire here, a well contaminated there, a wagon accident on an isolated road. None of it was the kind of thing Matthew could prove with what he had, but all of it together was the kind of picture that only assembled itself one way. He told Blevins on a Wednesday morning that he had decided Caldwell was not the right situation for him and that he would be moving on. Blevins looked at him for a long moment with the blank, measuring look of a man calculating odds, and said pleasantly that he hoped Matthew had found his time in Caldwell instructive, and that he hoped he would have a safe journey. The pleasantness of it was more unsettling than anger would have been. Matthew did not move on. He took a room at Mrs. Calloway's boarding house on 2nd Street, and he went to see the county sheriff, a man named Harlan Briggs, who had the look of someone who had been doing a job for so long that the job had worn grooves in him. The conversation with Sheriff Briggs was not encouraging. Briggs listened, asked 3 questions, and then leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling and said that he had heard concerns about Roy Blevins before, and that without documentary evidence of a crime rather than the suggestion of one, there was not a great deal he was positioned to do. He said this with the carefully neutral tone of a man who might have had other feelings about it, but had learned to keep them behind a professional wall. Matthew thanked him, left the sheriff's office, and stood on the boardwalk in the late April afternoon sunlight for several minutes thinking through his options. Then he walked to the general store, bought a pound of coffee and a piece of hard candy that he did not need, and asked the storekeeper, Mr. Alderman, where Letitia Fairchild's property was located exactly, because he needed to speak with her about something that concerned her land. Mr. Alderman, who was a small man with a large mustache and the expression of someone who found most of life slightly bewildering, gave him the directions and then said, "She's not an easy woman to talk to, Mr. Quinn, just by way of notice." "I'm not looking for easy," Matthew said. He rode out to the Fairchild place late that afternoon. The spring sky was doing something spectacular in the west, the sun going down in layers of orange and rose behind the flat horizon, and the 40 acres of the Fairchild homestead looked, in that light, like exactly what it was: someone's considerable effort made visible on the land. The kitchen garden was carefully tended, the fence lines were straight and well maintained, the house had been recently whitewashed on the south-facing wall, and there was a clean smell of wood smoke and turned earth and the particular sweetness of new grass that the evening wind carried toward him as he rode up the track to the gate. Letitia was in the barn when he arrived. He could hear her moving around in there, the sound of feed being poured, the soft nicker of Constance acknowledging the activity. He dismounted at the gate, tied his horse, and went to the barn door and knocked on the frame. She appeared in the interior dimness, holding a feed bucket, and looked at him with the alert stillness of someone whose first instinct on unexpected visitors was practical preparation. "Mr. Quinn," she said. "Miss Fairchild." He took off his hat. I left Roy Blevins' employ 4 days ago. I'm not here on his behalf or anyone's behalf but my own, and I would like to tell you some things I found out while I was working for him, because they concern your property and your safety." A long pause. The barn cat moved across the hay-strewn floor behind her with complete indifference to the conversation. "Come in," she said. He told her everything. The legal filing challenge, the pattern of acquired properties, the overheard conversation about Cutter, the survey stakes. He laid it out methodically, the way he arranged information when he wanted someone to be able to assess it clearly, without performance or exaggeration. She listened without interrupting, setting down the feed bucket after a moment and leaning against the stall partition with her arms crossed and her eyes on him with that steady amber attention. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. The horses moved softly in their stalls. Outside, the dusk was deepening. "The filing challenge," she said. "What technicality?" "He claims there was a 30-day gap between your father's initial claim submission and the official recording, which under territorial filing rules would have created a window for competing claims. He has a lawyer in Wichita named Faraday working on it." "That is not accurate," she said immediately. "The gap was 11 days, not 30, and the county clerk's office in Wellington has the original stamped receipt from the recording date. I can put my hand on that document in 10 minutes. She was not alarmed. She was calibrating. He would need to alter the county record to make his case or bribe someone in the clerk's office. "Yes," Matthew said. "Which is the kind of thing a man who contaminates wells and arranges wagon accidents might not find outside his ability," she said quietly. "Yes," he said again. She looked at him. "Why are you telling me this?" It was the right question. He had known she would ask it, and he had thought about his answer on the ride out. "Because it is the right thing to do," he said. "And because I don't work for Roy Blevins anymore, which means I don't have any obligation to his interests, and I have the particular feeling that I am going to have strong opinions about whatever happens to this property." The last part surprised her. He could see it in the slight widening of those amber eyes before she restored her composure. "That is a very particular thing to say about land that is not yours," she said carefully. "It is," he agreed. "I'll be honest with you, Miss Fairchild. I've been in Caldwell 12 days, and in those 12 days the most interesting person I've met is you, and the situation that seems to most require someone paying attention to it is yours. I'm not declaring anything except that I'd like to help if you'll let me." She looked at him for a long, searching time. He did not look away from it. He had the sense that looking away would be the wrong answer to a question she was asking without words. "I do not require rescuing," she said. "No," he said. "I can see that clearly. I'm not offering rescue. I'm offering an extra set of eyes and a willingness to do whatever is useful." Another silence. Then she uncrossed her arms and said, "Have you eaten?" "No. I have rabbit stew and cornbread," she said. "If you are going to tell me about a man who might be bribing county officials to take my land, you can do it at a table." They ate at the kitchen table in the yellow lamplight, and what happened at that table over the next 2 hours was something neither of them had expected. They talked. Not the careful, managed conversation of two people being polite to each other, but the real kind, the kind that moves quickly because both people are thinking at the same speed and keep finding the other one already there when they arrive at an idea. They talked about the legal strategy for protecting the land claim, about the best way to get an independent survey without alerting Blevins, about who in Caldwell might be sympathetic and who was likely on Blevins's payroll. But they also talked, in the natural way that conversation migrates when two people are genuinely at ease, about other things, about James Fairchild and how he had built this place from raw land, about the years Matthew had spent moving through the territories, Texas before Kansas, Missouri before that, work of various kinds, nothing dishonest but never quite settled, about what it meant to build something that was yours versus what it meant to keep moving through other people's built things. "Do you want to settle somewhere?" she asked, refilling his coffee cup with the ease of someone who had made the decision to stop treating him as a stranger. "I never found the right somewhere," he said. "I've been particular about what somewhere would need to look like." "What does it need to look like?" He considered the question seriously. "Like something worth staying for," he said. "Not just geography, the right kind of work, the right kind of—" He stopped. "Person," she said. "I was going to say community," he said. "But yes, I suppose both." She looked at him steadily, and there was something in her face that was not the careful, composed expression she wore for the world, but something quieter and more private, a kind of recognition, as if she had heard the answer to a question she had been sitting with for a long time. "The town thinks I am too fierce to be loved," she said. She said it without self-pity, as a statement of existing conditions, the way you would say the east field is dry or the well needs new rope. "The town is wrong," he said quietly. She looked down at her coffee cup. "You have known me for less than 2 weeks, counting a brief conversation through a fence." "I know," he said. "I'm not making a declaration. I'm stating what I can see from where I stand, which is that fierce and worth loving are not opposites. In my experience, they frequently coincide." When he rode back to Mrs. Calloway's boarding house that night, the stars over the Kansas plain were enormous and extravagant, the way they got when the air was clear, and there was nothing for 100 miles to interrupt the sky. He rode under them with the strange lightness of a man who has put something down that he did not know he was carrying. The next 3 weeks were purposeful and practical and charged, quietly, with something that grew between them the way spring things grow, not dramatically, but with the steady insistence of life finding its way. Matthew hired on with a small cattle operation run by a man named Deacon Walsh, who was honest and paid fair wages, and asked only that a man work hard and keep his word, both of which Matthew found easy. He spent his working days at the Walsh Ranch, which was 6 miles north of town, and his evenings frequently at the Fairchild place, where he and Letitia were building a defense of her land claim that was thorough enough to withstand whatever Blevins' lawyer in Wichita had been constructing. He rode out to the Hennessy place and examined the survey stakes himself, documenting their positions relative to the original 1871 survey markers, which were set in stone at the creek bed, and which Blevins had apparently hoped Letitia had either forgotten about or been unable to find in the brush along the bank. She had found them. She had found them a year ago and had recorded their position in a notebook that she kept in the locked box under her bed, along with the original deed, the county recording receipt, and every piece of correspondence that had ever passed between her and Roy Blevins or anyone acting on his behalf. "You kept everything," Matthew said one evening, looking through the organized contents of the notebook with something approaching reverence. "My father taught me that paper was more powerful than a gun in most situations," she said. "He said a gun could stop a thing from happening once, but paper could stop it from happening ever. He sounds like he was a remarkable man." Her face softened in the lamp light in a way it rarely did. "He was the best person I have ever known," she said. "He saw me clearly and loved what he saw without reservation or qualification. I did not realize until after he was gone how rare that was." Matthew looked at her for a moment. She was sitting across the table from him, her dark hair loose around her shoulders because it was late and she had taken down the pins hours ago, and the lamplight was doing something to the amber of her eyes that made them look like lit windows. "It should not be rare," he said. She looked back at him. "No," she said, "it should not be." The moment held, full of something that neither of them named yet, and then she looked back down at the notebook and pointed to a line in the survey notes, and they both returned to the practical work of protecting her 40 acres. The danger arrived on a Tuesday in mid-May. Letitia rode into Caldwell in the morning to collect supplies and stopped at the post office, where Mr. Fessler, the postmaster, handed her a legal envelope with the return address of Faraday and Associates, Wichita, Kansas. She stood on the boardwalk outside the post office and opened it, and read what was inside with the careful stillness of someone receiving news they have been partly prepared for. It was a legal notice asserting that the original Fairchild homestead claim had been recorded incorrectly in 1869 due to a clerical error that created a 31-day gap between filing and recording, which under the Homestead Act provisions and subsequent Kansas territorial land statutes rendered the claim subject to challenge by prior competing interest. The competing interest was, of course, Roy Blevins. The notice gave her 60 days to respond through a licensed attorney and appear before a county land hearing in Wellington. She folded the letter precisely and put it in her coat pocket and went to find Matthew. She found him at the Walsh Ranch where he was mending a section of the south fence. He saw her face when she rode up and set down the tools immediately and walked to meet her at the gate. She handed him the letter without speaking. He read it. His expression went through several things, a careful reading neutrality, then a sharper focus, then something that was quiet and determined. "The 31 days," he said. "That is not what the county record shows." "No," she said. "The county record shows 11 days." Which means either Blevins's lawyer has a different document from a different source, which I cannot account for, or someone has altered the county record in Wellington. "When did you last confirm the county record?" 8 months ago, when I requested a copy after Blevins first approached me about buying the land." She paused. "I should go to Wellington and look at the original myself." "We should both go," he said, and then caught himself. "If you want company." She looked at him for a moment. "I would," she said. Deacon Walsh gave Matthew 2 days off without complaint, expressing what he knew about Roy Blevins in terms that were colorful and entirely unambiguous, and they rode for Wellington the following morning, a 30-mile journey southeast that took most of the day on horseback. They rode together, and the conversation was easy and continuous, in the way of people who had found each other's company comfortable without quite deciding to, talking about the flat expanse of spring Kansas around them, about the hawks circling over the eastern ridge, about the particular quality of light over the prairie in late morning that made the new grass look like something precious. They stopped at noon to rest the horses by a small creek that ran through a cottonwood grove, and Letitia unpacked the food she had brought: bread and salt pork and dried apple, and they sat on the creek bank in the shade and ate in the comfortable silence of people who have learned that silence with someone can be its own form of closeness. "You do not have to do this with me," she said after a while. "This is my fight, not yours." "I know it's yours," he said. "I'm not trying to take it from you. But a fight can be yours, and someone can still choose to stand beside you in it." She looked at him sideways. There was something in her expression that was careful and also a little fragile, like something that wanted to believe itself. "Men who have offered to stand beside me in the past," she said slowly, "have generally meant that they wanted to stand in front of me, blocking the view." "I know," he said. "I have met those men. I am not one of them." A pause. The creek moved over the stones with a gentle, reasonable sound. "No," she said quietly. "I believe you are not." Wellington was a larger town than Caldwell, with a proper courthouse and a county records office that occupied 2 rooms at the back of the building. The clerk was a precise, thin man named Albright, no relation to the Caldwell Reverend, who found their request for the original Fairchild homestead filing with the air of someone who found all record searches slightly tedious. The original filing was brought out from the archives in a leather binder. Letitia and Matthew stood side by side at the records counter and looked at it together, and what they found confirmed the worst possibility. The original date stamp on the recording receipt had been altered. The 11 in the date had been carefully, skillfully changed to a 31, in ink that was close to but not quite matching the original, a difference visible when Matthew held it at an angle to the light from the window. "That is a forgery," Letitia said. Her voice was very steady. "Yes," Matthew said. Clerk Albright had watched them without expression. Now he came closer and looked at where Matthew was pointing, at the angle of the light showing the 2 different inks. His expression remained carefully neutral, but something shifted in his eyes that was not professional disinterest. "That would be a serious matter," he said carefully. "It is a serious matter," Letitia said. I have in my possession the original copy of the recording receipt that was given to my father James Fairchild at this office on the 11th of March, 1869. The date on my copy and the date on this archive copy do not match because the archive copy has been altered. The clerk looked at her for a long moment. He was calculating something, Matthew could see, calculating how large a thing had landed in his records office and what his own position was in relation to it. "I will need to speak with the county recorder," he said finally. "Yes," Letitia said, "you will." What followed was not quick. It was the particular slow machinery of institutional consequence, which moves with the enthusiasm of a rock being pushed uphill by cautious hands. But it moved. The county recorder, a man named Delaney who took a genuine and immediate umbrage at the suggestion that his records had been tampered with on his watch, opened an inquiry within the hour. Matthew provided a written statement. Letitia provided her copy of the original receipt, which she had brought in the locked document box she had transported in her saddlebag for exactly this possibility. By 4 in the afternoon, Delaney had sent a telegraph to the sheriff in Sumner County and another to the state attorney general's office in Topeka. By the time they rode out of Wellington in the early evening, with the long horizontal light of a Kansas sunset making the road ahead of them look like a painting, Letitia's land claim was no longer in question. The forged record had been flagged, the original receipt had been officially notarized and re-entered, and the Faraday and Associates challenge had been referred to the Attorney General for investigation. Roy Blevins's legal maneuvering was finished. They rode in silence for a while. The emotion of the day, which Letitia had held contained and purposeful through every hour of it, seemed to settle around her now that the work was done, and she rode Constance with her eyes on the road ahead and something moving in her face that was private and considerable. "You should feel good about today," Matthew said. "I feel tired," she said, "and grateful," a pause, "for the company. You would have done it without me." "Yes," she said, "I would have, but it was better with you there." She glanced at him sideways, a quick look, not the long measuring assessment she usually gave him. "It is generally better with you there." He did not respond immediately. The horses moved together on the road in the fading evening light, their hoofbeats finding the same rhythm without being asked. "I am glad of that," he said at last. They made camp that night in the cottonwood grove where they had stopped at noon, because the return journey was too long to complete in darkness on unfamiliar roads. They built a small fire and heated water for coffee, and sat on opposite sides of the fire with their bedrolls behind them. And the night sky above the cottonwoods was the complete, overwhelming kind that the open plain produces, stars from horizon to horizon without anything to diminish them. "My father used to say," Letitia said, looking up at the sky, "that the sky was the same over every piece of ground in the world. He said when he was young in Virginia and the farm there was failing and everything felt small and trapped, he would look at the sky and remember that the same sky covered 100 miles of open land where a person could start fresh and build something real. And then he came out here and did exactly that." "He sounds like he believed in the possible," Matthew said. "He believed in the earned," she said. "He had no patience for things that were simply hoped for. He said hope without work was just waiting." She smiled slightly at the fire. "He was a practical man. But he was also the most quietly hopeful person I have ever known, both at once." "Those are not contradictory things," Matthew said. "No," she agreed. She looked across the fire at him. The firelight was on his face, making the planes of it warm and particular, and there was something about his expression that was open in a way she had not seen before, the careful, composed man relaxed by tiredness and firelight and the aftermath of a hard day done well. "He would have liked you," she said. "He had good judgment about people." Matthew looked at her. "I would have liked him," he said simply. The fire crackled softly. The cottonwoods moved in the nighttime wind above them. "Matthew," she said. It was the first time she had used his given name. He heard it differently than he had heard names before, with a specificity that made something in his chest recognize itself. "Yes," he said. I have been thinking about something you said the first evening we talked, that fierce and worth loving are not opposites. She was looking at the fire, not at him, and her voice was careful. I have spent a long time being told they are. That the things that make me capable of managing this land and building this life and standing up to Roy Blevins are also the things that make me unsuitable, difficult, too much. She paused. I have mostly made peace with it. But I have not entirely made peace with it. What would making peace with it entirely look like? He said quietly. She looked up at him across the fire. I suppose, she said, it would look like believing that someone could see all of it, not just the parts that are convenient or decorative and still want to stay. He held her gaze. The fire moved between them. I see all of it, he said. I have been paying attention since the first day on the road. I see how you run that place and how you protect it, and how you know more about land law than most lawyers, and how you eat supper without apologizing for your appetite, and how you can assess a man in 30 seconds and be right about him. I see how you loved your father and how you carry that loss. I see how you let yourself laugh when something is genuinely funny and how you go quiet when something genuinely hurts. He paused. I see it, and I am not going anywhere. The silence that came after was different from the silences before. It had a new quality, the quality of something that had been said that could not be unsaid and did not need to be. I am not going to make this simple, she said. I do not know how to be simple. I know, he said. I don't want simple, I never have. She looked at him for a long, full moment. Then slowly, something in her face changed. Not the composed expression she wore for the world. Something underneath it, something that had been behind every conversation and every evening at the kitchen table and every moment of riding beside each other on the open road. It was warm and certain and a little fearful, the way something real feels when you admit it for the first time. Decent men, she said softly, are rarely what fierce women require. No, he said, and there was a thread of quiet humor in his voice and something much deeper underneath it. They are not, which is convenient because I have never particularly wanted to be decent in the specific way they mean it. I want to be honest, and I want to be strong where strength is needed, and I want to stand where I say I'll stand. That is a different thing. She smiled then, the real smile, not the polite one, not the composed public one, but the one that started in her eyes and arrived everywhere else with the warmth of morning light, and it was the most disarming and beautiful thing he had seen in 30 years of watching the world. Yes, she said, it is a different thing. They rode back to Caldwell the following morning in the early gold of a spring day that felt celebratory without any intention of being so, the sky wide and clean and the road straight ahead of them. They did not have to say that something had shifted between them. It was simply there, like the new quality of air after rain, present and undeniable. Roy Blevins's affairs collapsed with a thoroughness that felt, to the people of Caldwell who had been quietly uncomfortable with the man for years, like a stone dam finally breaking. The Attorney General's investigation into Topeka moved faster than anyone expected, partly because Letitia's meticulous documentation gave them an unusually clear starting point, and partly because, as it turned out, Blevins had been pulling similar maneuvers in 3 other counties, and the Attorney General's office had been collecting complaints about him without enough connective tissue to act until Letitia's case provided it. Cutter left Caldwell quietly before any legal proceedings formally named him. Blevins himself was served with a state warrant in late June, and the business of his subsequent legal troubles moved through the Wellington courthouse over the following months with the grinding certainty of a millstone. The town of Caldwell experienced a period of quiet recalibration in Blevins's absence. Properties that had been subject to his various pressures relaxed. People who had been selling to him from a position of disadvantage discovered that the market for their land without his manufactured desperation was rather better than it had appeared. The Silver Spur Saloon, which had been partially financed by Blevins, passed to its bartender, a cheerful man named Gerald, who kept good whiskey and did not care about anyone's business transactions. Letitia's 40 acres were secure. Matthew Quinn was still in Caldwell. He had taken on more permanent work at the Walsh Ranch, which suited his skills and his character, and which Deacon Walsh had been pleased to offer when it became clear that Matthew intended to stay. He had moved out of Mrs. Calloway's boarding house and into a small cabin that Walsh provided for his full-time hands, and he had become, in the way of men who stay in a place and do reliable work and keep their word, a known and trusted figure in the town. The courtship of Letitia Fairchild, if one were to call it that, was conducted in the very particular way of two people who are both accustomed to plain dealing and have no patience for pretense. He came to the Fairchild place on Sunday afternoons when his work allowed, and sometimes on weekday evenings. They rode out together on the property, and she showed him the work she had done on the south fence and the new section of irrigation ditch she had dug from the creek to the kitchen garden, and he offered his hands to whatever needed them without being asked twice. He fixed the hinge on the barn door that had been stiff all winter. She cooked and they ate and they talked endless real talk, the kind that builds a shared understanding of two people's actual minds. And sometimes they sat on the porch in the evening after supper and watched the sky change and did not say anything, because they had discovered they were equally comfortable in each other's silence. He told her about Texas, about the years working cattle drives up from Abilene, sleeping under the sky with 20 men and 10,000 longhorns, learning every weather pattern and every horse's temperament and every man's breaking point. About the family he had come from, a mother in Missouri who had died when he was 15, a father who had been a good man in the particular limited way of men, who did not know how to open themselves to their own grief, two brothers he had lost track of over the years of moving. About the loneliness of that much moving, which he had called freedom for a long time because freedom sounded better than lonely. "When did you stop calling it freedom?" she asked. "When I stopped moving long enough to notice the difference between the two," he said. She told him about the years after her father's death, the learning curve of managing the property alone, the months of error and correction, the cattle she had lost to a river crossing in the winter of 1877, and how she had replaced them the following spring with money she had made from selling timber from the north end of the property. The slow building of competence from necessity. The way the town's eligible men had circled and retreated, and how she had initially grieved it and then decided she would not, and then quietly continued to grieve it in the private place. "I thought there was something genuinely wrong with me," she said. "For a period of about 6 months I thought that seriously, that the thing in me that could not make itself smaller for someone else's comfort was a defect." "What changed?" he said. "My father's ledger books," she said. "Going through them after he died, he had kept meticulous records, every planting, every harvest, every expenditure and income, all the practical data of the farm. But at the back of the ledger he had kept a separate section, personal notes, things he wanted to remember." She paused. "There was an entry from when I was about 10 years old. It said, 'Letitia told the Wilson boy today that his arithmetic was wrong and she was correct and she did not apologize for it. I was afraid to watch and proud when I watched. She is going to be a remarkable woman. The right man will know how to be thankful for it.'" She was quiet for a moment. "I read that after 4 months of being alone and grieving him and also grieving the parts of my life that were not working. And I thought, he was not wrong about the remarkable part. And he was not wrong about the right man part either. The issue was simply that the right man had not appeared yet." Matthew looked at her in the evening light. "He was not wrong," he said softly. She looked at him for a long moment, and the amber eyes were warm and clear and full of something that she had stopped trying to contain several weeks ago. "No," she said. "He was not." He kissed her for the first time on a Saturday evening at the end of June, standing on the porch of the Fairchild house in the warm dusk with the smell of the kitchen garden coming up sweet from behind the house, and the first fireflies just beginning in the grass of the south pasture. He had been about to leave, his horse was already at the gate, and she had walked him out in the way she always did, and they had stopped at the porch steps and stood for a moment in the particular charged suspension of two people who have been circling something and have both arrived at the edge of it. He said, "Letitia." She said, "Yes." And the yes had contained so much that it was almost entirely sufficient by itself. But he kissed her anyway, carefully, and with full intention, and she kissed him back with the complete honest directness of a person who had decided to mean everything they did. When they separated, she looked at him in the dusk with the expression she had when she had completed something important and found it exactly as real as she had hoped. "You should come to Sunday supper tomorrow," she said. "Yes," he said. "And the Sunday after?" "Yes," he said. He rode back to the Walsh ranch under a sky full of summer stars with the particular lightness of a man who has stopped moving and found the right somewhere. He asked her to marry him in August, on the porch after supper in the heavy warmth of a Kansas evening, with the katydids conducting their enormous argument in the grass, and the sky purple and deep at the horizon. He did not make a speech about it. He was not a man who was good at speeches, and she was not a woman who required them. He said, "I would like to marry you, Letitia. I want to build something with you, and I want to stand beside you every day of however long we get, and I believe we could make something good and real together. I do not have a great deal to offer except myself and my work and my word, and I know your 40 acres are yours, and I would never ask for anything about that to be otherwise. But I want to be here with you if you want that." She was quiet for a moment, in the way she was quiet when she was thinking something through precisely and had no interest in rushing it. Then she said, "My father's note in the ledger said the right man would know how to be thankful for what I am, not willing to tolerate it, thankful for it." "I am," he said. "I am more thankful for you than I know how to say, and I have been paying attention for 4 months, so I know something about what I'm saying." She looked at him in the purple dusk, and what was in her face was the most unguarded thing he had ever seen from her, all of the fierce competence and the private tenderness and the grief that had been worked through and the hope that had survived it, all of it present and visible. "Yes," she said, "I want that." He took her hand, and she let him, and they sat together on the porch in the warm Kansas night with the stars coming out overhead, and the 40 acres of the Fairchild homestead lay around them in the soft darkness like something that had been waiting for exactly this. They were married in September of 1879, in a simple ceremony at the Methodist Church in Caldwell, with Hester Prout and Deacon Walsh as witnesses and Reverend Albright, who managed the occasion with the gracious awkwardness of a man who had said something uncharitable about the bride 2 years previously, and was aware of the fact, presiding with genuine goodwill toward the proceedings, if not absolute comfort in them. Letitia wore her mother's dress, which she had kept in the cedar chest her father had built, altered to fit her by the patient and skilled hands of Mrs. Calloway, who turned out to have been a seamstress before she had been a boarding-house keeper, and who did the work as a wedding gift with a directness that echoed Letitia's own. Matthew stood at the front of the church in his best coat and watched her come down the aisle, and felt the thing he felt when he saw her do anything with total intention, which was a kind of stunned, simple gratitude that had no adequate vocabulary. The reception was held in the Prouts' yard, with the whole town in attendance and the weather cooperating in the full extravagant way of a Kansas September afternoon, warm and golden with that particular end-of-summer light that makes everything look slightly more beautiful than it is in other seasons. Clement Dover came and was gracious about it. Percy Whitfield sent a note of congratulations from his family's ranch, where he had apparently found himself a wife from Wichita. Augustus Crane shook Matthew's hand and said he was a very fortunate man, and appeared to mean it genuinely. The evening of the wedding, sitting together on the porch of what was now their home, the arrangement they had agreed on, that Matthew would move into the Fairchild house, and his wages from the Walsh ranch would supplement the farm income, and the property would remain in her name and their joint names both, which was the legal arrangement Letitia had researched in the law books she had borrowed from the Caldwell library. Matthew looked out at the 40 acres in the September dusk and felt the words settle into him that he had been avoiding calling things for 30 years. Home. You are quiet, Letitia said beside him. Thinking, he said. About what? He looked at her, his wife, which was a word he was going to need time to become adequately comfortable with the full weight of, and said, about the fact that I have been looking for this for a very long time without knowing that was what I was doing. She took his hand, her fingers lacing through his with the same practical directness she applied to everything, and leaned against his shoulder. So have I, she said. The first winter of their marriage was the kind that teaches you things about a person that nothing else does. Kansas winters in 1879 and 1880 were not gentle. January brought a blizzard that kept them in the house for 4 days, with the snow drifted to the windowsills and the wind conducting its enormous cold monologue against the walls. And they were in the enforced close company of two people who are still, in some ways, learning the full geography of each other. They discovered that Matthew Quinn woke early and made coffee before the sun was up, and could be trusted to have it ready without being asked, and that Letitia Fairchild had no patience for anyone who tried to talk to her in the first 10 minutes of morning, but enormous patience for everyone and everything after that. They discovered that she planned to the degree that she always had 3 alternative approaches to any problem, and that he was the kind of man who preferred to assess the actual problem in front of him before deciding, and that these were not contradictory approaches but complementary ones. They had their first real argument about the south fence and whether to replace the entire run or repair the damaged sections, which was the surface argument, and was actually about the larger question of how decisions about the property would be made together. And it was sharp and direct and entirely honest, and ended not in retreat, but in a genuine resolution that improved on both of their individual positions, which surprised both of them and then did not surprise either of them. They had other arguments, in the way of people who are both strong-minded and who take things seriously. But the arguments were always about real things, and they always ended in real resolution, and neither of them ever said anything they could not take back in good conscience, because they both knew the difference between winning a fight and destroying something worth having. In the spring, Letitia told him she was expecting a child. She told him at the breakfast table on a Tuesday morning in March, matter-of-factly, over the biscuits she had made the night before. She said it the way she said most things, directly, without preamble, with her amber eyes on him watching his response. He set down his coffee cup and looked at her. "Letitia," he said. "I know," she said. "It is, I have had several weeks to adjust to the idea. I wanted to be certain before I said anything. Are you well?" "I am very well. I have been to see Dr. Meade in town, and he says everything is as it should be." He reached across the table and took her hand, and she let him, and he held it for a moment without speaking, because there was not any speech adequate to the size of the thing he was feeling, which was enormous and quiet and full of the particular profound surprise of life exceeding its own expectations. "Are you pleased?" she asked, and there was something in the question that was careful. Letitia, who was not careful about most things, who faced most things head-on without preparation, was careful about this because it mattered in the particular way that things matter when you have wanted them quietly for a very long time. "I am overwhelmed," he said, "in the best way that word has ever been used. I am more pleased than I know how to show you right now." He tightened his hand around hers. "Are you pleased?" She smiled, the real smile, the one that started in her eyes. "Yes," she said, "I am." The pregnancy progressed through the spring and early summer with the same efficient determination that Letitia brought to everything. She continued to manage the kitchen garden and supervise the cattle, and keep the property running with accommodations that she made when she needed them and not before. She was not sentimental about her changing body, but she was attentive to it, treating it with the practical care of someone who understood that it was doing a significant job and required support. She read everything Dr. Mead recommended, and several things he did not know she had found, because she approached the experience the way she approached all experiences that were new to her, with thorough research and the intention of knowing everything relevant before she needed it. Matthew watched her through this period with the attentive care of a man who had learned that caring for Letitia did not mean taking things from her hands, but rather making sure she never had to do important things alone. He was there when she needed company and useful when she needed help and silent when she needed quiet and funny, quietly and unexpectedly, when she needed to laugh. He had a dry humor that surfaced at the right moments, and she had discovered early in their marriage that making her laugh was something he took private satisfaction in, though he was careful not to make a performance of it. Their son was born on the 14th of August, 1880, on a warm summer morning with the windows open and the smell of the kitchen garden coming in on the breeze, delivered by Dr. Mead with Hester Prout in attendance. He arrived with an opinion about the proceedings that he expressed in considerable volume, which seemed appropriate given his parentage, and when Matthew first held him small and red-faced and enormously alive, he stood at the window of the room with the morning light on both of them and felt something so large and specific and irreplaceable that he could not have found words for it in any language. They named him James, for Letitia's father. James Fairchild Quinn was, from his earliest days, the kind of child who approached the world with comprehensive enthusiasm. He had his mother's dark eyes and his father's steady examination of new things, and from the time he could pull himself upright on the furniture, he moved through the house, and then the yard, and then the wider property with the single-minded determination of someone who has a great deal of ground to cover and intends to cover all of it. Letitia was a mother the way she was everything fully present, clearly devoted, and without any apology for also being Letitia Fairchild Quinn, who still kept the property records and still knew the cattle count better than anyone and still had opinions about the south fence. Matthew watched her with their son and felt the love for her that had been growing in him since a Saturday on the porch in June expand into something that no longer surprised him by its size, but continued to astonish him by its constancy. By the fall of 1881, the Fairchild Quinn farm was running better than it ever had, partly because two competent people are more than twice as effective as one and partly because Matthew Quinn turned out to have a facility with cattle that Deacon Walsh had always valued, and that applied equally well on a smaller property where it could be focused entirely. They had expanded the herd from 4 head to 14, had broken ground on a second irrigation channel that Letitia had designed from the creek, and had traded timber from the north section for materials to add a proper room to the house that would be needed as James grew, and their family might, in time, grow further. The town of Caldwell, which had watched the marriage of its most independent woman to the reliable, quiet stranger with the interest of a community that follows real stories with more attention than it follows performances, had arrived at a consensus that seemed to satisfy everyone, that Matthew Quinn was exactly the right kind of man for Letitia Fairchild, and that the earlier predictions about her unlovability had been the kind of thing people say when they are frightened of something they do not understand. Clement Dover said this to Matthew one day at the feed store in a conversation that was partly intended as an apology and partly as a statement of adjusted opinion, and Matthew listened with the patient attention he gave to all statements from honest men and said simply, "She was always worth understanding. Most things worth anything require some attention." Dover nodded and weighed out the feed grain and said nothing more about it, which was the right response. The winter of 1881 into 1882 was milder than the previous two, and the relative ease of it gave them time and warmth that they used well. They read in the evenings. Letitia had a collection of books that her father had accumulated over 20 years, and that she had added to whenever the budget allowed, And Matthew had developed the habit of reading beside her in the lamplight with James asleep in the next room, the kind of quiet domestic intimacy that he had never had in 30 years of moving, and that he found, every evening, to be the most complete form of satisfaction he had ever encountered. She was reading one evening when she set the book down and said, without preamble, in the way she said everything, "I think I am expecting another child." He looked up from his own book. He was ready for this in the way that a person is ready for good news they have been half expecting, with the particular gratitude of something wished for quietly and now delivered. "Dr. Mead," he said. "Tuesday," she said. "I wanted to tell you first." He set his book on the table beside him and looked at her across the lamp light, at the woman who had come to him, over 3.5 years of marriage, as fully and without reservation as she had come to everything, who had given him her property and her trust and her fierce, intelligent company and their son, who had showed him every day what it meant to stand beside someone who was completely and genuinely themselves. "Come here," he said. She crossed the room and sat beside him on the settle, and he put his arm around her and she leaned into him in the easy way they had developed, her head against his shoulder, both of them looking at the fire. "James is going to have opinions about this," she said. "James has opinions about the color of the barn door," Matthew said. "He will manage." She laughed, the real laugh, low and warm. "He gets that from you. He gets that from both of us, and you know it." She lifted her head and looked at him, and the amber eyes in the firelight were full and warm and certain. "I love you," she said. It was not the first time she had said it, but it was said each time with the same direct completeness that she brought to everything she meant, and it landed on him each time the same way, like the first time, like something real and specific and chosen. "I love you," he said, "more than I know how to account for." She settled back against his shoulder, and the fire crackled, and outside the winter Kansas night was dark and cold and vast, but the house was warm with lamplight and the knowledge of two people who had found exactly what they needed in each other, and nothing of significance was missing. Their daughter was born in the fall of 1882, on a golden October afternoon when the cottonwoods along Elm Creek were brilliant yellow, and the sky was the deep autumn blue that Kansas does better than anywhere. She came into the world with the same vigorous opinion about it that her brother had expressed, and she had Matthew's dark eyes and Letitia's set jaw, and a quantity of dark hair that made Dr. Mead shake his head and smile. They named her Ellen, for Letitia's mother. James Quinn, aged 2 years and 2 months, regarded his new sister with the complex interest of a small person confronting something wholly unprecedented in his experience. He studied her at considerable length while she slept in the basket by the stove, and then turned to his father with the serious face he used when he was formulating something important. "She is very small," he said. "She is," Matthew agreed. "She does not do anything yet. She is working on it." James considered this and found it acceptable and went back to his toy soldiers, and the matter was settled. The years arranged themselves, as years do when the essential conditions are right, into a coherent and good life. The Fairchild Quinn farm continued to grow, not dramatically, not in the way of men who were building empires, but steadily, in the way of people who knew what they were building and why they were building it, and were not trying to be anything other than what they had deliberately chosen to become. Matthew's reputation in Caldwell and the wider Sumner County had solidified by 1883 into the specific kind of respect that accrues to a man who is known to be fair and reliable, and to say what he means and mean what he says. When Deacon Walsh announced in the spring of that year that he was looking to retire and sell the ranch, he came first to Matthew and offered him right of first purchase on the cattle operation, not the land, which Walsh's son would inherit, but the herd and the operating agreements and the established buyer relationships that were the real business of it. Matthew and Letitia sat with the numbers for 3 evenings in a row, at the kitchen table with the ledger book spread between them and coffee cups at their elbows and the children asleep in the next room, and worked through every angle of it with the meticulous shared attention of two minds that had been working together for 4 years and knew each other's thinking well. "It changes the scale of what we are doing," Letitia said on the third evening. "Yes," Matthew said. "It does. It is a good change," she said. She ran her finger down the column of figures she had calculated. "The infrastructure costs are front-loaded, but the margin on the expanded operation by the third year is significant. You are telling me you want to do it," he said. She looked up at him with the slight smile of someone who has been seen clearly. "I am telling you the numbers support it and my judgment says yes, but I want to know what your judgment says." "My judgment says yes," he said. "I trust Deacon's assessment of the herd, and I trust your numbers, and I trust that between us we can manage the expansion without losing what we already have." She nodded, closing the ledger. "Then we do it." They did it. The Quinn cattle operation, as it became known in the county by 1884, was run with the same organized competence that Letitia brought to everything she touched, and with the practical skill with cattle that had been Matthew's professional life for 15 years before Caldwell. And together these things produced a business that was both financially viable and ethically run, which was not always a combination that the Sumner County cattle market made easy, but which they maintained because it mattered to both of them. James was in school by 1886, a fact that he greeted with the enthusiasm of a person who has discovered that other people exist in organized numbers and that there is a great deal to be learned about them. He was his mother's son in his appetite for information, and his father's son in his patience with other people's pace of arriving at conclusions, and his teacher, Miss Fairweather, who had come to Caldwell from Ohio with a trunk full of books and an admirable determination to educate as much of the county as would hold still, wrote in her first assessment that James Quinn was, in her estimation, going to be a person who made things happen. Ellen at 4 was already demonstrating the selective fearlessness that her parents regarded with a combination of admiration and private exhaustion. She had her mother's dark eyes and her father's steadiness, and a particular combination of both their personalities that produced a child who would try anything once and then, if it failed, work out methodically why it failed and try again differently. Letitia watched her daughter one afternoon in the kitchen garden, where Ellen had constructed a small dam in the irrigation ditch to create a pool for a collection of pebbles she was arranging with architectural seriousness, and felt the specific joy of recognizing something of yourself in someone who is entirely their own person. "She is going to be extraordinary," Matthew said from beside her. "She already is," Letitia said. He put his arm around her in the warm afternoon, and she leaned into him, and they watched their daughter rearrange her pebbles with the focused satisfaction of someone with a clear vision. "I want to tell you something," Matthew said. "Tell me." "I want to tell you that I was 30 years old when I came to Caldwell, Kansas, and I had spent those 30 years looking for something without being able to name it, and that everything I have now, this land, these children, this life, I have because you let me stand beside you." He paused. "And because you were exactly who you were and did not change it for anyone. I want you to know that I am grateful for that every day." She turned to look at him, this man who had ridden into her county in the spring of 1879, and who had looked at everything she was without flinching and had said, quietly and with total intention, that he was not going anywhere, and had kept that word through every subsequent year with the absolute reliability of someone for whom a word given was a thing done. "The town used to say I was too fierce to be loved," she said. "I know. They do not say it anymore." "No," he said. "They do not. Because of you," he shook his head. "Because they could finally see what was always true. You were always worth loving, Letitia. I just happened to know it before they caught up." She looked at him for a long moment in the afternoon light, the amber eyes warm and clear and full of the love that had been growing in her for 7 years now, with the steady insistence of water finding its level, filling every available space. "You are a good man," she said. "I try to be the right kind," he said. "Decent in the way that matters." She smiled at that, the complete smile, the one she had been giving him since a June evening in 1879 on a porch with fireflies in the grass. "You are," she said. "You always have been." They stood together in the garden of the Fairchild Quinn farm, while their daughter arranged her pebbles with architectural conviction, and the late afternoon light moved golden across their 40 acres of good Kansas land, and the life they had built between them was present around them in everything. The straight fence lines, and the tended garden, and the sound of James coming up the track from school, calling out as he came, and the solid walls of the house her father had built, and that she had kept, and that they were keeping together. And all of it was real and earned and permanent in the way that only things built by two people who love each other completely and without reservation can be. Permanent. In the fall of 1887, Letitia wrote a letter to the county record's office in Wellington, enclosing a notarized statement about the forgery of her father's homestead claim, requesting that a formal notation be added to the county archive, indicating that the claim had been certified as authentic and unencumbered, as a matter of official record. She had been meaning to do this for years and had finally, with the particular thoroughness of someone who does not consider a thing fully resolved until every loose end has been attended to, done it. The county recorder, who was still Delaney, sent back a letter confirming the notation had been made and expressing his personal compliments on the matter, which he described as having been handled with an exemplary attention to documentation that he wished more claimants shared. She showed the letter to Matthew at supper, and he read it and set it down and said, "Your father would be pleased." "He would be," she said. She folded the letter carefully and put it in the document box with the original deed, the recording receipt, and the letters from the Attorney General's office confirming Roy Blevins's conviction for land fraud, which had come through in 1881, and which she had kept for exactly the same reason she kept everything. Because paper was more powerful than a gun, and a closed record was better than an open wound. The document box also contained, in the very back, a small piece of folded paper that she had taken from her father's ledger book. The note about her, written when she was 10 years old. She had kept it because it was the truest thing anyone had ever said about her before Matthew Quinn, and she wanted James and Ellen to know, someday, what their grandfather had seen in their mother before they themselves had arrived to confirm it. In 1888, the Quinns added another room to the house. The family had expanded, and the 2 rooms were no longer sufficient for 4 people with the particular energy and opinion levels that the Quinn children had been born with. Matthew built the addition himself over the course of the summer, with James as his earnest if inexpert assistant and Ellen providing critical commentary from the yard. Letitia kept the building materials organized and the ledger of costs and brought lunch to the site every day with the reliable care of someone who understands that people doing hard physical work need to be fed. The room was completed by September, solid and square and correctly angled, which James pointed out with the satisfaction of a 9-year-old who had been present for every step of its construction. "Papa says the secret is taking time to measure twice," he told Ellen. "Mama says the secret is knowing what you need before you build it," Ellen said. "They are both right," Matthew said from the doorway, and both children looked at each other and found this unimprovable and moved on to other topics. That winter, Letitia discovered she was expecting again, which she announced at breakfast with the same directness she had used the previous 2 times, and which Matthew received with the same expansive gratitude, and which James received with the dignified equanimity of a 9-year-old who understood the family was changing and had decided this was acceptable, and which Ellen received with the excited declaration that she hoped it was a sister, because she had done the mathematics and found sisters to be statistically more useful than additional brothers. The baby was born in the summer of 1889, a second son, whom they named Thomas, for no family member in particular, but because both of them had independently thought of it and offered it within seconds of each other on the same evening, which they took as a sign of something that needed no further analysis. Thomas James Quinn arrived in the world in July with dark hair and his sister's eyes and his brother's opinion volume, and the family of 5 arranged themselves around the new fact of him, with the flexible affection of a household that had learned to incorporate change as a feature rather than a disruption. Ellen, at 7, was deeply invested in Thomas and regarded him as a project of the most interesting kind. James, at 9, was generous with his sibling in the particular way of an eldest child who has decided that generosity is the more dignified position. Thomas, for his part, had opinions about the world from his first day in it, which everyone agreed was exactly right. The spring of 1890 came to the Fairchild Quinn farm with the same extravagant regeneration that Kansas springs always produced, the land going green in great sweeps across the plain, the cottonwoods along Elm Creek showing their pale new leaves, the irrigation ditches full of snowmelt running clear and cold. Matthew rode the fence lines on a Tuesday morning in April, which was what he still did at the beginning of every growing season, and when he came back to the yard at noon and dismounted and tied his horse at the post, Letitia came out of the house with 2 cups of coffee, and they sat together on the porch steps in the warm noon sun the way they had been sitting on those steps for 10 years and some months. "Fence is good," he said. "I thought it would be," she said. "I walked the south section last week." "Of course you did," he said, and she heard the warmth in it, the specific affection of a man who knows a woman's habit of thorough attention and finds it not exasperating but admirable. She handed him his coffee. They sat in the comfortable silence that had been between them for years, the silence that was itself a form of conversation, full of everything that did not need to be said because it was already known. The 40 acres of the Fairchild homestead, which James Fairchild had built from raw Kansas ground in 1869, lay around them in the spring morning. The cattle grazed in the south pasture. The kitchen garden was just coming in, the first green shoots of the season pushing up through the turned earth. The house was solid and warm behind them. From inside came the sound of Ellen explaining something to Thomas in the earnest, instructional voice she used when she had decided something was educational. And somewhere further away, James's voice calling from the direction of the barn, where he was doing his morning chores with the responsible thoroughness of an 11-year-old who understood that work was how things got done. Matthew looked out at all of it, at the land and the life in the morning, and then he looked at Letitia beside him, this woman who had been called too fierce for any decent man to love, who had faced down land fraud and legal challenges, and the small cruelties of small town, opinion with the same steady competence she brought to everything, who had kept her father's 40 acres and her own name and her own self entirely intact while also opening herself, completely and without reservation, to love and to him. "You know what I think about," he said, "when I ride the fence lines." "What?" she said. "The East Road," he said. "The first time I saw you drive that wagon past the livery. Before I knew your name or your story or anything about you. Just that one moment of watching you go past and knowing, with no evidence for it at all, that there was something there worth knowing." She looked at him with the amber eyes warm in the morning light. "I thought you were probably working for someone I didn't trust," she said. "You were right," he said. "And then I thought if he is not, he might be worth a conversation." "Through the fence," he said. "Through the fence," she agreed. She looked at the spring morning and the 40 acres and the life they had built in it. "I was called too fierce for any decent man to love," she said. "I used to hear that and feel both angry and bereft. And now when I think of it I feel," she paused, finding the word precisely, "relieved, because it was true. Decent men were not what I required. A decent man would have asked me to be smaller. A decent man would have wanted me grateful for his tolerance. A decent man would have seen my fierceness as a problem to be solved." She looked at him. "You were never that. You were never decent in the way they meant it. You were something better." "What was I?" he asked, because he genuinely wanted her answer. "You were honest," she said, "and strong, and you looked at everything I was and you were thankful for it." the way my father said the right man would be. She reached over and took his hand, her fingers lacing through his in the familiar way that had not lost its particular rightness in 10 years. He was right about that, too. Matthew looked at her hand in his, the capable hand that ran 40 acres and kept meticulous records and could string fence and cook supper and hold a sleeping child, and had never, in all the time he had known it, been idle or uncertain about the work it was set to do. He was right about everything, Matthew said, including the remarkable part. She laughed the low, warm laugh that he had been hearing for 10 years and that still, every time, was the best sound in the full range of what the world produced. "You are going to say something ridiculously affectionate," she said. "I am," he agreed, "because it is true and it is morning and I have the rest of my life to say it in which I intend to take full advantage of." She leaned against his shoulder, in the way she had been leaning against his shoulder since a June evening in 1879 on this same porch, with the fireflies in the grass and the whole uncertain, wonderful open future ahead of both of them. And the spring Kansas morning lay around them in all its unreasonable beauty. And the children were inside, and the cattle were in the pasture, and the fence was good, and the land was theirs and they were each other's. And nothing about it was small or compromised or less than what it should be. It was, as it had been building to since the moment a man rode down the East Road past a woman stringing fence on a Thursday afternoon in April of 1879, exactly right. The 40 acres of the Fairchild homestead would pass in time to James Quinn, who would work it with his own capable hands and add to it from his own considerable effort, and to Ellen Quinn, who would go to Wichita and study law and become, in 1905, one of the first women admitted to the Kansas bar, citing in her application letter her mother's example of meticulous legal documentation as her primary inspiration. And to Thomas Quinn, who would run cattle in the next generation with his father's facility and his mother's organization, and would become known in Sumner County, the same way both his parents were known, as someone whose word was reliable and whose work was honest and who understood that the things worth building required the full measure of everything you had to give, but that was later. Now it was a spring morning in 1890, and Matthew Quinn sat on the porch of the house that James Fairchild had built, with his wife beside him and her hand in his, and the land around them was green and new, and the sky over the flat Kansas horizon was that particular shade of blue that looked like a beginning. And Letitia Fairchild Quinn was leaning against his shoulder, and the whole of their life together was present around them in everything that had been built and kept and loved and earned. And it was enough, and it was more than enough, and it was everything that fierce and real and lasting love had ever looked like when it was finally allowed to be exactly what it was.